Hi, you're watching Bloomberg Live right here from the World Economic Forum, and I have with me John Studzinski, Vice Chairman of Pimco. John, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Oh, it's, you're one of the highlights of Davos every year.
You're one
and
of
your
the highlights
program
of
is
the
one
Davos.
of the highlights.
Thank you for saying that. You are also the one guest I have in Davos every year who spots the things that most other people miss and who isn't afraid to call a spade a spade. So I'm going to ask you the question straight off. All this gloominess, is it overdone?
I think the gloominess is way overdone.
Okay.
The United States economy has had 37 quarters of economic expansion. So of course there's going to be a slowdown. I think the US is still in the mode of growing but slowing. And I keep saying to people, growing but slowing. It's not going to grow at the same rate. The growth is slowing down, but it's still growing. Maybe at some point we're going to have to change it to slowing but growing. But it's still growing but slowing. On the global front, people are very focused on China. We've heard doom and gloom this morning about Chinese growth. The Chinese economy is a big economy. It's been growing for 40 years. The Chinese government, as you know, is a very well-trained. People are trained in every job over a period of 5, 10, 15, 20 years before they're actually put in the next job. So I think the world has faith in knowing that the Chinese government knows what it's doing at managing its economy. It's got a complicated population. It's got issues of still with pollution, rural poverty, a whole series of other issues on credit in the shadow banking market. But they know this, and they're coming to grips with this, quite robustly. China is going to slow down, and I think China is trying in its own way to manage people's expectations. So it's not seen as a shock, but it's seen more as a gradual slowdown.
Okay. So you're saying the US is not as badly off as people are describing it to be, and China is not going to be half as bad as most people anticipate it will be
When
this
people
year.
talk about the US, if you look at all the data, everyone says, okay, the recession is most likely to be in 2020. Now, you and I both know that if all the pundits are saying it's going to be in 2020, it's either going to be in 2019 or in 2021. So
Ouch.
Let's focus on one of those two things, because all the data, people are just not used to such a longer term period of growth, even if it's slower growth, because historically, as you know, this is unprecedented in terms of an economic expansion, which we've realized since 2008.
John, would you be half as optimistic as you are right now if the Fed hadn't dialed back some of their speak? When we saw the minutes of the last Fed meeting, it did seem that maybe we're looking at 2 hikes and not 3. Has that helped moderate your sense of pessimism for the US economy? Because, for instance, you look at other parts of the world and there are reasons to be concerned. Germany, Italy, in Europe, Brexit in the UK, the government shutdown in the US that many business leaders have said could actually have a big impact on GDP growth this year. And then China, as you've described yourself.
I have enormous respect for the Fed, but I think when we're looking at the economy from an investing point of view, it's one window, it's one perspective. I think we saw the last jobs number of 312,000 jobs. That was a very robust number. I'm less worried about this focus on growth in the United States or growth in China. I'm more worried about what I call the global sort of geopolitical recession. You now have a very strong authoritarian backbone of leaders emerging around the world. You've had a strong swing to the right in Europe. And remember, Europe's celebrating its 20th anniversary as the European Union as a sole trading bloc. And you've seen entities 20 years, okay? 20 years, something needs to be sort of shaken a bit, looked at and decide what's working, what needs to be improved. And Europe has just started to do that when the Brexit issue arose. And now you're seeing it in France, you're seeing it with the AfD in Germany, and you're seeing it with the rise of the right in Central Europe.
Yeah. So you're not concerned about Europe?
I'm very concerned about the geopolitical side of Europe. And
but not as much the economic side?
Well, I think the two go hand in hand. I guess remember the historical legs on the table of Europe were Merkel, Macron, and May, the 3 M's. And now you have effectively that group, that club is breaking up. Merkel's retiring at some point. Macron has had a lot of domestic issues, and May is dealing with Brexit and the exit there. So you don't have this core in Europe anymore to lead sort of, remember the stability of Europe that we see today, a lot of that was anchored by those through economies in 2008.
Right.
Which was 10 years ago. That was the 10th anniversary of the European Union. So we're 10 years beyond that now, and things have changed.
Okay. If you're feeling that much more positive about the global economy relative to many other people here, then what's your view on how you see asset flows across the global economy? It's a question we often ask from the emerging markets point of view, because every time we've seen either an economic slowdown or a change in monetary policy stance, financial markets in India get back hit.
Well, India, and you and I have talked about this before, India is not necessarily, because of its current trade characteristics, it's not really part of the same trade club as sort of China, the United States, and Germany. It's still very much an agricultural or agrarian society, and it's still very much based upon a whole series of domestic issues. So I don't see, and I also see India benefiting from low oil prices, and that's probably going to continue to benefit it, because I think the price of oil, the price of energy, if anything, is going to stay low, and that will have a positive boost, a continued positive boost to the Indian economy.
So you think financial markets this year are going to be able to weather these minor slowdown or moderations in growth?
I think financial markets are very volatile. They're very hypersensitive to the media. Even today, for example, with the amount of attention, the sort of discussed slowdown in the United States that people worry about, or the slowdown in China, the media gives that a lot of attention, and then markets look at that and say, how do I interpret it? I'm more worried about the geopolitical characteristics of the world and how these individual personalities and these individual leaders all manage to maintain their domestic agenda of jobs and growth and prosperity, but at the same time get along with each other.
Okay, great question for me then to segue into the Indian elections. You've watched India closely as an investor, as an advisor, sometimes informally, to state governments and the central government. What do you make of where we stand today on the anvil of yet another general election? How's the economy looking to you? And politically, how do you assess India?
Well, growth is going to slow down. Inflation's low. The capital account has been well managed. I think the banking system obviously lacks enough capital to make probably as many loans as it should in terms of certain types of growth. The oil price will keep the economy stable. There's a lot of attractive elements to invest in India today still. I think Mr. Modi, he's had to make a transition from successfully leading Gujarat as a hands-on leader to trying to manage a much more complicated, much more sophisticated in terms of hierarchies and personalities and constituencies country. So I think the world would expect him to probably win the election, but probably with more of a coalition if he has to cope with that, if he's willing to cope with that at this point. But maybe it's too early to even comment on who's going to win the election.
Does Mr. Modi feature in your theory of a geopolitical recession?
I think Mr. Modi so far has been very skilled in his own diplomacy in dealing with whether it's the relationship between India and China, whether it's the relationship between India and Russia, whether it's the relationship between India and the rest of the world. I think he's probably much more diplomatic and measured than a number of the other people. He also, remember, a lot of the other authoritarian leaders are very much playing to a very aggressive base, and they're trying to develop that base. He obviously has a number of people who support him. There's obviously this constant discussion in the international investment community about Hindu nationalism. But having said that, he is managing a very complicated, big government with, I think, a relatively small team. And I think, if anything, he probably needs a bigger team when he starts his next tenure.
How do you, and when I say you, I mean how do foreign investors look at this issue of Hindu nationalism in India playing out? over the last few years?
I think they've always felt that India's the largest democracy. It's a great pluralistic society, respecting multiple languages, multiple faiths. So I think people find it a bit puzzling because it's something that they've never confronted before in India. And they're going to watch it carefully and continue to watch it carefully, I think, during the whole period of election, because I'm sure it will be discussed.
Okay. Davos this year is marked with the absence of any very large marquee speakers. What are you looking forward to attending or listening into this 4-day week?
You know what I'm really thrilled about this year? Finally, after all these years, we've talked about conservation, we've talked about the environment. But I think in part because Donald Trump has been so robust in his trade discussions with China, global corporate CEOs are focusing on their supply chains. And they all started doing it when they started looking at, well, what is our supply chain in China? And now by looking at their supply chains, they're becoming a lot more intuitive about what's in their supply chain in terms of not just conservation and environmental issues, but labor issues, slavery issues, other type of ethical issues that relate to the S in ESG. And so I think you're seeing a lot more practical operating discussion here at Davos for the first time about the sustainability goals as it relates to how people lead and manage big businesses.
So this is not the end of Davos as we knew it. A lot of leaders I've been speaking to today have been saying this is my last year. I'm not sure I want to come back next year.
You know, there's a lot of impressive things going on here. And I think the problem is many people come here to talk to their clients, but very few people actually come here to take part of the content. But there's so many layers of Davos. There's important people meeting other important people. That's one group. I'm not really in that group. There's important people talking to big groups of people. But there's a lot of various powerful niche activities that are moving the ball along in a number of areas. Artificial intelligence this year is getting a lot of attention, as it has over the last 2 or 3 years. And next year being the 50th anniversary, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of interesting projects and programs discussed.
Not yet the end of Davos. John Studzinski, thank you so much, as always, for speaking with us.
Cold hands.
Have a good trip.
Thank you.
Yes, for the rest of the week.
And thank you again for inviting me.
No, my pleasure entirely. Thank you, John.